Hi everybody. This lesson is going to focus on the development of the European states in both Eastern and Western Europe. The objectives are to explain the factors that led to the development of these centralized states, and then also identify the new monarchs of their period and explain the characteristics of their rule. So this here is a map of Europe in 1500, and just a few things I want you to know before we start talking. If you look to the far left in the west, southwest is Aragon and Castile, which will unite with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella into the modern day Spain. Of course, you see France in the west. And then this area up here, let me mark it, these what they call Habsburg lands, is the region known as Burgundy. This is southern Burgundy here, which we'll also talk about later on. But these lands, modern day Belgium, Netherlands, you're going to hear several terms used. You'll hear the Low Countries, you'll hear Burgundy, you'll just hear in some cases the Netherlands and that as well. So do keep that in mind. If we talk about the Holy Roman Empire, we're going to really be talking about Germany. This is the first German Empire, the first German Reich, so to speak. But it really wasn't an empire, something we'll discuss as we go through the class. Of course, you can see the Italian states, the boot of Italy right over here, where I'm drawing the arrow. And then in the east, we have Poland, Lithuania, which was actually combined into quite a giant of a country. You have Hungary, which will ultimately be absorbed by Austria and the Habsburg lands. And then you have the Ottoman Empire over here, and the Principality of Moscow or Muscovy, which is going to develop into Russia. So I just want you to kind of see all this as we go through it. So before we start talking about Eastern Europe, I want to talk a little bit just about the formation of states as a whole. In the West, in particular, Spain, France, and England, we're going to see a very dramatic move toward political centralization. The princes played a very central role in this based on Machiavelli's theories. And in what we call the military revolution, they relied very heavily upon the advance of technology of warfare. Gunpowder underpinned the development of mobile military units, and rulers were able to defend and conquer to expand their territories as well. In the East, they were a little bit slower. There was a little more cultural diversity. In particular in Poland and in the Holy Roman Empire, the ambitions of nobles kept from strong monarchies from developing, which is going to be a play there as well. But if we look at the East, once again, I had brought this up earlier, you're going to see in the early 1400s the tail end of the Mongolian Empire as well. And that would be where modern day Russia is, up through the Principality of Moscow on this map. The Mongols were in decline by the 1400s, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We're also going to see the newly emergent Ottoman Empire in the south that'll continue to grow as well. So going through and talking about a few of them, let's talk first about Poland, Lithuania. As I said earlier, this was really kind of the centerpiece until the 1400s. It was ruled by the Jagiellon family, but by the mid to late 1400s, the monarchy became elected. So although Poland, Lithuania was very large, there really wasn't much power. The nobles, it was called the Polish Diet, or also the Polish Sejm, S-E-J-M, would elect the king. And often they were too jealous to elect each other. And we're going to see by the 1600s, Poland ceases to really be a strong power. We're also going to see the growth of the Ottoman Empire. We talked previously about the expansion. Mehmed II had conquered Constantinople right over here and had brought it. And we're going to see throughout the 1500s expansion up into Hungary and through this area. The Ottomans were probably the most serious threat, and many European Christians viewed them as infidels, led by Charles V, even later Philip II. Will be fighting to keep the Ottomans out of Europe, and we'll see these religious wars as well as these wars for political boundaries. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the development of modern Russia, or Muscovy. And basically, between 1460 and 1530, Muscovy had a territorial expansion of 1.5 million miles. The Mongol Empire began to diminish. And what had happened was that Ivan III, who we know the Great, had basically refused in the mid-1400s, refused to pay the Mongols tribute and began the First Great Rebellion. And then after doing this, he essentially began conquering surrounding areas. And he was known as the Grand Duke of Muscovy, Ivan III. He gave rewards to those who supported him, very similar to the new monarchs in Western Europe. And he combined his sovereign authority with the religious authority of the Orthodox Church. In fact, in 1453, Constantinople had been known as the New Rome. It had been the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Rome was the center of Roman Catholic Christianity. And when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Muslims in 1453, Ivan, who had married the niece of the last Byzantine Empire, is going to proclaim Moscow to be the third Rome, or the New Rome. And this third Rome, in Constantinople, the Tsar, later Tsars, and the church will work hand in hand, dating back to Ivan's combining his authority with that of the church. And as I said earlier, great territorial expansion as well that will take place and go. Ivan III begins to call himself Tsar. In fact, that title came from the Caesar, the old Roman emperor, but it was really Ivan IV who became the first Tsar of Russia. And so I want to talk a little bit about him in just a moment. But before we get into it, I just want to kind of go over the social groups that existed in Russia. One of the important vocabulary words that you need to know this year are boyars. And boyars essentially are the nobles. They were the largest class in Russia. There was a military class, not the largest class, excuse me. They were the most important class in Russia, actually the smallest class, maybe 2% of the population. But we're going to see this nobility have a lot of say early on, and they'll try to, take back and gain some of their power like the other Eastern nobles will as well. The majority of the people were peasants who worked the lands. And what's interesting, in Western Europe, we're seeing a decline in serfdom, but in Eastern Europe, we're going to see more and more peasants becoming serf throughout the 15, 16, and even 1700s. As far as Ivan IV, he became the first Prince of Muscovy in the 1530s. Once again, coming out, well after Ivan the Great. And he, for the most part, was, known as ruthless. He really took a lot of power from the hereditary boyars. The boyars had tried to keep power the way they had in Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, and he just did not. And thus where he gets his nickname, the Terrible, ruthless reprisals against this independence. And we're going to see instead a military service class gain power as well. Peasantry, they lose most of their existing rights and mostly become serfed. But we do see Ivan build up a stronger Russia. Ivan's personality, however, didn't lead to a Russia that was going to maintain. In fact, in one hand, he played his cards quite right, and the boyars were complaining about his rule in the mid-1500s and said he had too much power, and he said fine, and he just quit being Tsar for about a year. Well, what happened was that the boyars started fighting amongst themselves over the Tsar, and ultimately a year later they asked him to come back, understanding that he would have this absolute power and continue, because that power at least provided stability. He also, unfortunately, had a hereditary heir, that his son, that he killed. And after Ivan's death, because of no hereditary successor, we're going to see what we call the time of troubles. And it's really going to be in about 30 years of foreigners trying to pretend to claim the Russian throne, and a time of weakness before the Russians get their act together in 1614 and elect Mikhail Romanov as the new Tsar. And we'll talk about him and the Romanov dynasty later on. Okay. I would also like to talk a little bit about Charles V. So Charles V is really a pretty significant guy. He, on one hand, he is the Holy Roman Emperor. He was elected in 1519 through 1556. He was the Duke of Austria, acquired a lot of lands there, the lands in blue that he acquired from his, might have been his, I think it was his paternal grandfather. His paternal grandmother was Mary of Burgundy. That's Netherlands, Belgium, these areas up in here that he acquired from her. He also, from his grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, maternal grandparents, he inherited Spain. With that, he inherited the Spanish Empire in the New World, and he controlled much of southern Italy. and consequently, elected Holy Roman Emperor. He was a super powerful person. He was the head of the Habsburg dynasty. And as we go through this year, you need to associate the word Habsburg with Catholic. And he was very Catholic. He fought many, many religious wars as well. He also fought wars against the French. So on one hand, his rivals were anyone non-Catholic, the Ottoman Turks, for example. Later on, the Lutherans in Germany as he's fighting civil wars. His main enemy, though, was Francois I of France, who's going to fight also a series of wars as well. And throughout the majority of his reign, he's fighting. What winds up happening by 1556, he's just simply exhausted. He actually abdicates. His brother becomes Holy Roman Emperor and takes his Austrian lands, but his son Philip takes the lion's share, becomes King of Spain. He takes southern Italy, gets his Burgundian lands, as well as the New World. More about that later on. But Charles was a pretty significant person, very much need to know, defender of Catholicism. Charles' one weakness as a German ruler was that German princes demanded, German nobles wanted to keep their power, and they did. And so we really don't see a true German empire as much as him just being the emperor of the German states. As far as the new monarchs, as I alluded to earlier, those are the big three countries' development in France, England, and Spain. And I want to talk about some characteristics of the new monarchs, these Western states. One of the first things that they did, they centralized their countries, and they were able to kind of bring themselves together. And so a few of the characteristics. Number one, this age of the new monarchs coincided with the Renaissance and exploration. So for example, I would say 1492 is a key date. On one hand, Ferdinand and Isabella were successful, and they defeated the Moors and took Granada, thus uniting the Spain as we know it. 1492, they also expelled the Jews to ensure religious uniformity. Strong Spain would be a Catholic Spain. In 1492, they sent Columbus to the New World, sponsored him, which is going to bring great riches to Spain. So the new monarchs coincided with this. Think late 1400s, early 1500s. They extended their political power through war, diplomacy, marriage. Once again, some examples of that. Louis the Spider is going to have the good fortune of encouraging a war between his chief rival, Charles the Bold, and the Swiss. Charles the Bold was the Duke of Burgundy. Charles the Bold was killed in battle, and Louis seized southern Burgundy for himself. We'll also see a lot of marriage. Ferdinand and Isabella, for example, united the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile to unite Spain, and later arranged for their daughter to marry the future King of England. And then diplomacy, intense negotiations with each other, and so forth to kind of continue with their power, to continue to build their power. They also are going to limit the power of the nobility. This was very important in their development and was used to enhance their own power and build themselves up as a state. Furthermore, they created efficient centralized taxation for their country. They were able to tax and build up their royal treasuries to keep strong power. They maintained strong standing national armies. In fact, Louis XI, or Louis the Spider of France, made Europe's first standing army, national army. Prior to that, they'd have to ask nobles for armies. And not only did they maintain strong standing national armies, they began to limit the size of noble armies, limiting nobles as threats. They encouraged trade both internally and externally, and would create free trade zones within. And later on, when they took colonies, such as the Spanish, they controlled all the trade of their colonies and took the resources. And they often enforced religious unities within their country. For example, Ferdinand and Isabella began the Spanish Inquisition, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So going and talking about these three countries, I want to talk about the big three, your three best examples to know for your new monarchs. Number one would be Henry of England, or Henry Tudor. And so the 100 Years' War ended in 1453 between England and France, and England found itself in shambles. In fact, 2 years later, a civil war called the War of the Roses began that lasted from 1455 through 1485. And this was a war between the noble houses, between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. It continued to get worse. The war showed ugly acts of brutality, murder, betrayal. But in 1485, the last York king, Richard III, was killed by Henry Tudor of the House of Lancaster. When he did this, he regained power, became the King of England, and peace returned. And one thing he did, he used marriage to ensure his rule. He married Elizabeth of York. Therefore, his future heir would have both York and Lancaster and would have a direct claim and a solid claim to the throne. Also, after the war, he hung those that opposed him. He rewarded those that stuck with him, and he created a new almost spoil system. They call it a peerage. Offices and spoils to those who, helped him throughout the war, which increased loyalty towards the monarchy. Those that he executed or hung, he took their lands as well. And we'll see a new economic prosperity begin in England. He also built something called the Court of the Star Chamber. And this was an interesting court that basically had all royal authority within it. It went against almost every bastion of English law. It reduced the influence of the nobility. There were secret trials without a jury, which went against English law. Nobles couldn't confront witnesses. So they were often tortured. But in doing so, he was able to kind of build up his own power. He took away nobles' private armies, took away their insignias, and, continued to grow England as a country. Ferdinand and Isabella are also great examples of these new monarchs. And they married in 1469 and eventually unified Spain. This was an interesting marriage. Isabella's brothers really controlled who she was going to marry and was trying to marry her to someone else that went against her wishes. And she met with Ferdinand's father and arranged their marriage. And so they went off, the two eloped, and were able to bring Castile and Aragon together to begin the unification process. Keep in mind, prior to the Renaissance period, Spain had been a mix of Catholic Christian, Muslim and Jewish people, generally living side by side. Many of the Muslims and Jews were part of a prosperous middle merchant class as well. But part of Ferdinand and Isabella's beliefs were that to have a strong monarchy, you needed to have one religion, and that would keep unified. And so they began their role of the Reconquista, where they fought to get Granada, the southern part of, let me show you here, the southern part of the peninsula, where the Moors, who were the Spanish Muslims, had lived. And by 1492, they were successful. The last Moorish stronghold surrendered. After that, they expelled the Jewish population, probably about 165,000 Jews that were forced to emigrate. About another 50,000 baptized and became Catholic, and many Jews fled to just other countries. We're going to see a lot in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland as well, during this time period. And with that, we see a very Catholic Spain. And once again, it will remain very Catholic throughout the period, really until the Catholic Church will have great influence in Spain until the 20th century as well. In addition to this, they also brought in the Spanish Inquisition. And this was without the permission of the Pope. They appointed a Dominican monk named Tomás de Torquemada, who oversaw it. And generally it targeted conversos, those Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of backsliding into Judaism. They began a wave of torture and so forth that lasted about 300 years for the Inquisition as well. And so we'll see, once again, a very strong monarchy, albeit a very Catholic monarchy. In fact, they were given the title the Catholic monarchs as well. Moving on from Spain, one other thing about Spain, I think I mentioned this earlier, they also sent Columbus. He sponsored his first voyage to the New World, brought them in great riches, and they also were able to begin to bring the power of the nobility down. One other unique feature of Spain, though, as much as they did centralize it, there was still a lot of regional nationalism. There was probably more resistance to Ferdinand and Isabella's joint authority in Spain than in some of the other countries. And we really don't see a true Spanish identity develop as much as we see a Castilian identity or an Aragonese identity that continues on for the next several hundred years as well. The last of the big three monarchs was Louis the Spider, or Louis the 11th of France. And Louis took over France after the 100 Years' War. He brought some of the soldiers who had been running around the country acting like they owned it and pillaging. He put them under control. He built Europe's first national army as well. And for the most part ruled with an iron fist. He used a lot of luck. I think I told you earlier he encouraged a war between Charles the Bold of Burgundy and the Swiss, and as a result was able to take this part of Burgundy into France, and it became part of the country. And he establishes what we call the Valois dynasty, V-A-L-O-I-S, and this Valois dynasty would actually rule France for about the next 150 years. And the last thing I want to talk about is the renewed Habsburg-Valois Wars. Renewed might not be the right word up here. If you remember, we had previously discussed the Italian Wars, where Italy became a battleground. But by the 1520s, the Valois leader, 15 teens really, the Valois leader was Francois I, and his greatest enemy was Charles V. Furthermore, you had Henry VIII of England, who was shifting sides. And these guys began fighting. If you look at the map, the orange lands are the Habsburg, green are Valois. There's also the Ottomans. Charles was balancing fighting Francis while fighting the Turks, as well as fighting religious civil wars in Germany. At one point, the Pope sided with the French, and Charles' Spanish troops went in 1527 went to Rome and sacked the city. They went berserk. The Pope essentially became a prisoner of Charles for the next several years, and the war just continued on, really with no clear winner. By the 15th, there were several peace treaties made throughout, and by the Charles abdicates by 1556. Francois is long dead, and by 1559, the Peace of the Pyrenees finally settles this war. Yet the Habsburg-Valois remain rivals. A rivalry that remains between the Habsburg and really the French. The Bourbons were the successors to the Valois dynasty, but this rivalry actually remains until the late 1700s. That is it for the new monarchs, and I look forward to seeing you in class next week.